Well, I am delighted to welcome Mike Cottmeyer back to the Agile Richmond miniVAte stage. Uh, Mike has been a presenter a couple of times at
Last
least.
couple of years, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So, Mike is going to tell us more about why Agile fails. Mike, the floor is yours.
Cool. Just jump right on in. Okay, excellent. Well, thank you guys super much for having me. I kind of missing the travel, miss seeing everybody face to face. Hopefully, this is the last round of remote presentations before we all get to get together again. Well, so if anybody's familiar with the things that I like to talk about, right? One of my big challenges is that when I was in industry and before went out and became a consultant, even before when I was working at version 1 as a consultant for them, even prior to starting my company LeadingAgile, what I was constantly doing was going into larger organizations and was trying to help them adopt agile principles and practices and mindsets and things like that. And what I was finding is that every place that I went, that whether it was the companies I was working in or the companies that version 1 was selling software to, or subsequently what LeadingAgile was consulting for, we found ourselves in a situation where the practices that we were trying to do, right, Scrum and daily stand-ups and things like that, were largely incongruent with how the organization was structured. And so I had this hypothesis fairly early on into this, where I talked about agile transformation was really about forming teams, building backlogs, and producing working tested software. Because if you think about it, how can you really do Scrum if you don't have a complete cross-functional team? How can you do Scrum if you don't have a really clearly articulated backlog? And how do you do Scrum if you can't produce a working, tested, validated increment of software at the end of every sprint? And then as you start extending that model up into the enterprise, we talk about team-based organizational structures. We talk about agile governance models and the ability to run small batches through your system, the ability to measure things in a way that actually supports agility rather than works against agility. And so I developed this transformation hypothesis that basically said that an agile transformation, and I'm really talking about agile transformations at scale, not trying to get a team of 6 or 7 people to do Scrum, right? But when we're talking about thousands and thousands of people, automobile manufacturers, financial institutions, pharmaceutical companies, right? All those kinds of things, defense contractors, right? You're really, what you're trying to do is you're trying to figure out how to align the organization and create the conditions within the organization where you can actually do things like form complete cross-functional teams that operate off of really clean backlogs that are able to produce a working test and increment at the end of every sprint. And so we started, exploring this topic within LeadingAgile formally, probably 6 or 7 years ago, and really started developing a science around how do you go in and how do you change the organizations so that you can do the agile things that we all value and want to get really good at. So what this talk's really about is how do you get your executives to buy into the fact that agile isn't just a process. It's not just a bunch of ceremonies and things that you do, but to really support it in a way to where not only the organizational structure is in alignment, the technology architecture is in alignment, the product architecture is in alignment. There's just so many different pieces that have to be in place. And so what I'm going to kind of do, and I'm going to be really transparent with you guys, because we're on the cusp of probably releasing like another white paper, another rev of this talk in a more formal way. But what you guys are getting is a bit of an amalgamation of 3 different thoughts that have been swirling around in my head for the last year or so, a couple a little bit longer than that. But we're going to start talking about the breadth of the problem that we're trying to tackle here. And part of the problem is, how do we measurably orchestrate change? Like, how do we do it in a way where there's like a value hypothesis, we can measure progress, right? All these different kinds of things. I'm going to talk a lot about the difference between team-based agile And what I think companies really want with enterprise agility, or maybe business agility, that might be a good word for it, and talk a little about the difference between even that and what does it take to actually transform. And then I'm going to get into some new and experimental content a little bit that I haven't really talked a whole lot about publicly, around the true nature of all of the different things that actually have to be impacted when you're doing large transformation, a little bit about how we're starting to explore getting there. So I have a lot of content. I'm going to hit it at a fairly high level over the next 40 minutes or so. So I talked about this idea of measurable value. So a lot of my early transformation talks, I talk about predictability, quality, early return on investment, cost savings, innovation, and product fit. Typically, most of the executive concerns tend to align into one of those buckets. The ability to make and meet commitments, the ability to do things at a reasonable cost, the ability to put things in market and get feedback, right? All those kinds of things. Those are typically the problems that an executive is trying to solve. I think it goes without saying at this point that nobody's interested in Agile for Agile's sake, right? Everybody's interested in Agile because we're trying to solve a business problem, okay? And so one of the things that I think as practitioners sometimes we lose sight on is, how do we anchor what we're doing to the business problems that our executives are trying to solve? So that's like the first thing that I think we have to really, really consider. And then the next thing is that on some level, whether you're working with consultants or hiring coaches internally, or it's just the teams of people that are doing things, there is going to be investment, there's going to be disruption, there's going to be change, right? All those different kinds of things. And so one of the things that I think we have to get really comfortable with, especially in places like, I mean, this is Richmond, right? And so it's like government space, and right, there's all kinds of contractors and things like that in the area. So we have to be able to measure progress. We have to be able to say, this is what we're going to go do. This is the outcome that we anticipate. And this is how that outcome is going to advance our ability to get closer to the goal. Okay, so a lot of times what we think about when we talk about measuring progress is, how many people have been trained? Do each teams have Scrum masters? Do each teams have a product owner? Right? I mean, there's a lot of like kind of superficial things that we talk about. But to me, what I think is the unit of value of a transformation is actually a better performing organization. So to the extent that you have product owners and the extent that you have Scrum masters, that's great. But what I a lot of times care about is, can each team establish a stable velocity against a known backlog? Do we know the backlog size relative to the release scope or to the annual scope? Do we understand the number of escape defects at the end of a sprint, right? Do we now understand the number of defects that are getting released into production, right? Things like that. So when I talk about measurable progress, we have to be able to talk about things like, how many teams are performing at the right level and are demonstrating the right performance characteristics. Not, again, are they trained, but are they actually performing at the level that we expect them to perform at? And then the last thing is this idea of measurable results. And a lot of times it's really interesting. I struggle with this with my team too. It's like the idea of leading indicators and lagging indicators. We know what an Agile organization looks like. We know the value that we're trying to get out of it. We can start to measure the things that we're doing, but what are the appropriate leading indicators that help us understand that we are moving towards a more adaptive enterprise? And sometimes that doesn't start with being a more adaptive enterprise. Sometimes that starts with being able to make and meet commitments, the ability to establish flow at the program and portfolio level, the ability to hit release objectives, the ability to deliver in smaller batches and to market, the ability to release faster, even if it's not as fast as we want it to be. Okay, so the idea of anchoring on executive value, the ability to, in effect, call your shots like you would maybe in pool, say, these are the 10 things that we're going to do over the next 3 to 6 months, and then be able to prove that you did them. And then the ability to measure actual incremental progress towards your value hypothesis. And what we found is that when you can stitch that story together, you can tell a pretty compelling story that keeps momentum going around the transformation work. But it's almost a non-starter if you don't do this, in my experience. It's like if you can't connect to these things, then people lose interest really fast. It becomes something that those teams do, right? There's just something, Agile's just something those Agile teams do, right? Or that work group does, or something like that. What we want to do is we want to keep the executives engaged, because they're going to be the ones that continue to fund it and continue to support the transformation and continue to make the changes within the ecosystem that we need for this to really work. So I started going down this path of trying to articulate, and I say articulate because it's like things that we know intuitively, but they're really hard to describe. We did a little conference down in Atlanta a couple of years ago. We're going to do again this year called Elevate Agile. And what we were trying to do is talk about the bigger topics around agile transformation and enterprise agility and business agility and things like that. But part of the problem that we have is that anything we do in the large requires agile in the small. As soon as you start talking about agile in the small, you kind of like relegate yourself down to the team level stuff. So part of what I'm hunting here is how do you separate the conversation? Like, what is business agility? And what is enterprise agility? What's organizational agility? And how is that different than team level agility? What we're doing at the Scrum team level, because they don't always necessarily, it's like one's a necessary precondition for the other, but just because I have team level agility doesn't necessarily mean that I have organizational agility. Because like what we're seeing a lot in a lot of the places that we go into is that where Agile is working most effectively at the team level, it's operating within exceptions, right? And I think you guys will probably see this a lot. Because we see it all the time in the government space. It's like there's a lot of good team level Scrum, but like everything about how that project or that initiative is governed is like doing everything in its power to work against what we're trying to do, right? So even though we're enabled or we're empowered to do Scrum at the execution level, right, we're still not operating with agility at the organizational level, right? And that's a problem. We have to try to figure out how to address that. So we started trying to explore some language around, okay, so what does it take to create sustainable business agility? Well, a lot of what we do with Scrum and SAFe and LESS and disciplined agile delivery and things like that is really about developing an agile operating model or an agile delivery model. And that business model around team level or department level agility is only part of the problem. Getting there safely and reliably in a predictable manner is critical, because if we can do it in a way that is predictable and planful, then we have the opportunity to build trust with the organization and they get confidence that the agile ways of working are actually better than the ways they used to do it before, can be more predictable, more precise, deliver on time, on budget, on cost, right, or on scope, right, more reliably than a waterfall project. But then also having the ability to change that ecosystem as we go. So we started to try to figure out how to pull apart the problem. And so I started talking about it like this. It was kind of like I'm thinking about these layers in terms of like what we've learned over the course of the last 20 years having these conversations. And so what we started off with Agile, I think, was this idea of a system of delivery at the team level. So if you think about Scrum, what Scrum is it's an operating model, business model for a team of 6 to 8 people to work with a single business person and to produce a working tested increment at the end of every sprint. As Agile went more and more mainstream over the last 10 or 15 years, what we found is that most problems were not team level problems. At a minimum, they were departmental level problems. And so I guess it's probably been 12, 13, 14 years now when Dean Leffingwell started writing the first books on SAFe. The RUP guys back in the day were trying to get involved in this. Boss Vode, Craig Larman with the large scale Scrum stuff. Guys like Al Shalloway with his Flex model, Scott Ambler with his disciplined agile delivery, right? What people were doing with those methodologies is they were trying to hunt a couple of things. They were trying to hunt, like, what do we do with the necessary planning cycles? Because sometimes sprint zero isn't enough. Sometimes just planning 2 weeks at a time isn't enough. It's kind of where disciplined agile delivery, in my opinion, kind of landed. And then also, what do we do with dependencies between teams? Because dependencies are really kind of the boogeyman of all of this stuff. Whenever we have dependencies between work groups, that's what's the thing that makes it really difficult to do Agile. So I think team level Scrum requires largely independent teams. I would suggest SAFe largely requires independent work groups, value streams, right? But a lot of times it's like, those are hard to come by in large organizations too, right? Because everything intersects and everything connects. And so what do you do with all this connectedness? And so about 6 or 7 years ago, we started really thinking differently about the Agile delivery model of, Scrum or SAFe or large scale Scrum versus what are the mechanisms for getting there. And so we talked about this idea of incremental and iterative development within the transformation lifecycle. So how do you pull a slice of the organization out, we call them expeditions, and move them to some sort of intermediate state? We call those things base camps. Language is arbitrary, but it was just a way of talking about it for us. And so we talked about, okay, let's get, maybe a group of about 8 or 10 teams. Maybe it's a value stream. Maybe it's a collection of business capabilities. Maybe it's a product, right? Something that the organization cares about that actually has value. And let's bring it to a known intermediate state. Let's get it predictable. I'm not worried about it being super agile right now, but let's use agile to get it really predictable. And what we were finding is that in the presence of dependencies, sometimes we could do Scrum-based things. I heard in the panel right before, somebody was talking about how the product owner and the tech lead should get together and plan a couple sprints ahead. 100%. 100%. For us, sometimes that's 3, 4, 5 sprints ahead. But if you're dealing at like a program or portfolio level, sometimes that look ahead at one level of abstraction needs to be 6, 9 months. Sometimes at like a release level, I need to understand like a release or 2 ahead. And then maybe at the team level execution, I'm looking 3 to 4 sprints ahead. And so I think about it a lot in terms of the idea of rolling wave planning, progressive elaboration. But if you think about it, agile methodologies don't really have a prescribed way of doing that. So what we found is that if we can get teams relatively well aligned, even in the presence of dependencies, and wrap them with a rational program and portfolio model, and do rolling wave planning and progressive elaboration on longer timelines, right? We could help the teams be more effective as agile teams, even though they were operating within higher levels of governance, but those higher levels of governance were more agile, right? And so sometimes in early stage transformations, we were installing compensating controls that enabled agile to work. They weren't necessarily as agile as we wanted to be. And then the whole transformation story started to become, as I get DevOps working, as I get technical practices working, and as I can start to do product extraction and break dependencies and increase encapsulation, then I could start deprecating some of the orchestration and some of the control over the teams, because the teams could operate more autonomously. And because what we found is there's dependencies between teams that were driving some of this forward planning, because it's like you don't want to do late dependency resolution, right? Because if you're dealing with dependencies late in the cycle, what tends to happen is that they end up like interfering with our ability to deliver on time. So we want to deal with high risk dependency laden situations early. In order to be able to do that, we have to be able to look a little bit further ahead than most agile methodologies typically prescribe. And so we kind of coined this thing around like get predictable, and then reduce batch size, and then start figuring out how to break dependencies. And then like once you got into the dependency breaking and you had encapsulated teams, then you could start attacking some of the funding models and start trying to form budgets around teams or delivery units. Right. And then you could start doing some more adaptive experimental stuff once you had the financial constructs in place. That was an interesting theory. It didn't quite play out that way when we started getting into some large mega transformations, which I'll explain later. But the idea is that we wanted to separate the idea of the agile methodology from how you transform and how you get there. A lot of times when I'm talking with SAFe organizations, and which is a perfectly valid model, like sometimes in an early stage SAFe transformation, you need more compensating controls. So you actually have to do some stuff that's actually even heavier than SAFe. And that's super popular in the agile community, as you might imagine. Right? There's some things you have to do that are even heavier than SAFe to get to SAFe. And then once you're at SAFe, like I think a lot of organizations can stay there, but I think some organizations even need to move past SAFe by continuously improving the ecosystem that those teams operate in. But what was fascinating, so this is like these 3 circles that are up on the screen are like, they're like a necessary precondition for business agility. And so, and like in our early stages, we were talking about this as if this was business agility. But what we started to do in our sales process was we were talking about this with executives, and they're like, well, yeah, that's just the stuff the teams do. I'm not really interested in team level agility. Right? That's kind of commoditized. What I'm interested in is business agility. How can you help there? And so what we started kind of hypothesizing, and I'm gonna go into this a little bit deeper here in the next couple slides, is that there's like a next level of learning that I think our community is exploring. We started with team level. We got really good at that if the conditions were right. Then we started exploring how to get multiple teams working in the presence of dependencies. Now we're starting to evolve how our thinking goes about how do we create the right ecosystems so that the team level agile and the enterprise level agile can actually work appropriately without a bunch of trade-offs. But that's almost becoming table stakes. We talk a lot about in LeadingAgile about having reliable systems that you can delegate into. Because if an executive team, if a strategy team can't say, this is what I need, and get what they need in a reliable and predictable way, it's very hard to trust that system's performance. It's very hard to let go of command and control and to let go of certain aspects of compliance and different financial controls and different, enterprise governance when you can't predict what the organization is going to produce. And so if we want the organizations around us to relax, we have to demonstrate that the product organization is a trustworthy system that they can delegate into. And so we started to kind of like with people we were talking to, with our clients, to say, okay, you can almost assume that these three things are in place. They're not often in place well, but you can assume these three things are in place. So what does business agility look like across products? What are the things in the system of delivery that need to be addressed now that you have a reliable system that you can delegate into? Then it becomes like, how do I actually go down the path of changing things like strategy articulation and product marketing and high-level product planning? How do I change how the organization makes and meets commitments to its customers? How do I change how financial governance and financial controls happen? Right. And those are what we're finding, is because I've got the story I'm going to tell you guys in a little bit about what starts to happen is in early stage transformations, all of the things that we're doing at the Agile team level are operating out of exceptions. And if you have a non-agile governance and you have all this stuff operating with exceptions at the team level, like, it's great for the teams, but it doesn't actually improve business performance, like at the macro level. And so what we have to do is we have to figure out how to bring those two things together over time. And again, early stage for me, this is like the first time I've really tried to talk this out in front of an audience. So I'll be interested in your feedback, right, if it resonates. And then the last bit, and this actually became really prevalent with some of our clients during COVID, right? So we have a couple of pharmaceutical clients, auto manufacturers, some defense contractor people that we're working with. And as you might imagine, for a lot of those kinds of companies, COVID turned the business model on its head. And they had to start, some of them had to like go from making cars to ventilators, or making one kind of molecule to a different kind of molecule. Lots of ways that the organization has to change. And so when you're talking about introducing entirely new capabilities into the enterprise, we need to be able to do that with agility as well. And candidly, I think that's actually the holy grail. I think that's what we're hunting. Okay. And I don't have all the answers, but I think that's what we're hunting. It's not team level agility, the ability to inspect and adapt against a backlog. It's not even product or enterprise agility, and the ability to inspect and adapt across maybe a product or a product line. But as an organization, how do I continuously and dynamically reallocate my systems and processes and practices to respond to a market that is potentially changing around me? I think that's what organizations are hunting, because things are moving so fast. So it's almost, and this is going to sound funny, right? But it's almost insufficient to just talk about the ability to change direction on requirements, assuming your product's static. How do I create a capability within the enterprise to where I can pivot the organization when the organization learns new things, right? So it's fascinating, okay? So this is a fairly well-known metaphor in the Agile community, but I've been thinking a lot about the story of the blind man and the elephant, because because there's a lot of words getting thrown out around us right now. I think about it. I've thought about for years. I named my company LeadingAgile 11 years ago, and I was just wondering how long the word agile was going to be able to be in our name, right? Because at some point, I figured, agile would be the flavor of the day and it'd be gone, right? And I'm actually surprised it has this much momentum 11 years in, or even 20 years in after the manifesto, right? So we're doing something right. I think people understand that there is a fundamental truth under what we're doing, and there's something there, and they're willing to continue to invest and hunt in it. But what's interesting is, like, so you think about like DevOps. Is DevOps agile? Well, it's kind of part of it, right? It's continuous integration, continuous deployment, agile. Well, it's part of it. Like when people talk about business agility, what's the difference between that and Scrum? We talk about digital transformation. Is digital transformation different? There's a couple of things that keep coming up in our world quite a bit. The idea of like a PDO, like a product-driven organization. Is that agile? What about, there's something that Gartner talks about called projects to products, right? We've understood for a long time that, or our industry has, is that we have to move out of this project funding metaphor into a product funding metaphor. But like, how do you get there? Is it the same? Is it different? Is it like, what is it, right? So there's all this stuff that's going on. And so I started thinking about this parable of the blind man and the elephant. And if you guys aren't familiar with it, I'll just give you just a quick recap. Went too far. But basically you have this, you have these, I think it's an Indian parable. And you have like three blind men that are touching an elephant. And one's like touching its nose and trying to describe it from the perspective of its trunk. And the other one's touching its ear and trying to describe it like it's almost like a palm frond or something like that. And, one of the blind men is touching its leg and trying to describe the elephant as like a tree trunk. And the reality is, it's like they're all right, but they're all wrong, right? Because they only see the thing that they see, but they don't see the broader picture that's involved. And so I started working with my team, my client execs, and my consultants that were out there on the ground, and we started trying to paint a picture of what is the entire scope of the world that needs to be agile, right? That needs to be addressed. And so we kind of hypothesized on some things. And I don't know if this resonates in your world or not. We found that for most of our clients, we can figure out how to tuck various things underneath these things. But the elephant, right? So as we did this diagram, I just did this for an internal talk for our consultants. And apparently I'm getting quoted in my organization. I don't even remember saying this, but apparently I said it. I said, if your systems and structures don't align with your customers and markets, you're going to struggle. So what I was basically saying when I said that, apparently, is that if your organizational design isn't aligned around the things that your customers care about, and your structures and your systems don't support the delivery of that value directly to your clients, it's going to be really difficult to get into an agile operating model. And so we drew customers and markets in the center, and we started talking about, we started off with the system of delivery, right? So the system of delivery is the things we've been discussing. It's things like Scrum at the team level and SAFe at the enterprise level, and some of the business agility stuff and the PDO stuff at the more at the business level. So we started talking about systems of delivery, right? And then the idea of product management, right? So that has to be addressed. Some of our early transformations, we had one client who we've had a great relationship with for almost 10 years now. One of the things she said, this is maybe a year 2 or year 3 transformation for us. She goes, we got really good at building the wrong thing, right? I mean, that happens all the time. So sometimes we start with product management and we try to drive the right things into a broken organization. Sometimes we fix the organization's ability to deliver and we get really good at building the wrong stuff. So product management has to be brought into alignment. Our ability to understand the customer, product marketing, product strategy, not just the ability to write requirements, but the ability to connect those requirements all the way up to the strategic intent of the organization. Right, which brings us into strategy articulating, right? How do we take the strategy of the organization and delegate that down into the teams? Like, what are we going to measure from an OKR and KPI perspective? What are our capability and service blueprints, right? How do we describe the organization in the form of a team-based organizational architecture that is aligned to the core business capabilities and the core products that are connected to strategy, that are connected to product marketing and intent, right? All this stuff has to kind of start to hang together. And then, and this is a big one, and I'm just telling you, if you guys aren't encountering it, you're going to be in the next couple years with the idea of how do you do funding and accountability models? How do you align investments to value streams? The industry's catching up, right? The business around the stuff that we're doing sees the possibility. But the question that we have to ask ourselves is, how do we start to move the finance organization into a way of working that exploits the agile delivery capability that we've been working on for the last 20 years, right? That's non-trivial. That's like a whole thing in and of itself. We're doing this with a Fortune 10 company right now. And it's not like you can even write a book on it. You have to figure it out because it's unique to that company and unique to their governance and unique to their delivery models. It's a super fascinating problem to try to solve, but it is there. It is absolutely part of the elephant. Technology and architecture. At the team level, it's things like technical practices and CI/CD. As you start to move up the organization, it's operations and infrastructure and enterprise architecture strategy. And how do we make decisions at that level that are congruent with what we're trying to do? DevOps, kind of falls into that category as well. And then the fun one, right, that I know you guys all deal with is the idea of compliance and controls, right? How do we get regulatory audit compliance to recognize that we have this new incremental and iterative delivery capability that we want to exploit for the overall advantage of the organization? But if our compliance and controls are not agile delivery system aware, right? They're not aware of our new funding models and our new ways that we're delegating strategy in the organization. Then again, we're constantly operating out of phase with how the organization does its stuff. Okay. So obviously talent and culture, skills, competencies, workforce planning. Workforce planning is like a huge thing. People are really struggling with what do you do with jobs, advancement, all kinds of different things in this agile world. How do we develop people? How do we get to a place where we're delegating into trustworthy systems rather than operating with a command and control type mentality? How do we get to a place where we're valuing collaboration over like internal competition within organizations? Very, very, again, just very difficult problems to solve, but it's all part of it. And then a lot of times it's really easy to marginalize the leaders and to leave them out. But what are the new roles that leaders are going to do? And what are the new behaviors that we need them to exhibit? What are the new mindsets that they need to bring to the table? But most importantly, what we're really trying to work on is, how do you teach managers to exploit or to manage or to run this new operating model without breaking it, right? It's kind of a fascinating challenge, right? Are we doing enough to teach managers and leaders how to run in this new way of delivering value, right? So it's kind of fascinating. And so we started exploring this idea. It's kind of riffing off of an idea that was probably out 8-9 years ago. It's not quite the same, and it's probably just will create confusion even telling you guys a story, but there's this thing of dual track Scrum at one point in time, and I kept thinking about it a lot. And the idea of dual track Scrum was that you have Scrum teams that are just scrumming along, delivering stuff every sprint, and the layer above is doing a lot of the look ahead work, right? So a lot of the product market analysis and the envisioning and the figuring out what the backlog needs to look like. I haven't heard talked about in a long time, but I'm probably not as plugged in as I used to be either. So this was stuck in my head. And what we started talking about was this idea internally of dual track transformation. We started hunting some words for it. And so we talked about this idea of base camps. And so in Leading Agile, we have this iterative, incremental and iterative hypothesis, this way that we transform organizations that basically takes vertical slices, team level, program, portfolio, and moves them to known states in a fixed amount of time. And so we talked about the idea of base camp one, where a lot of times in highly highly dependency laden organizational architectures, the first job of Agile is just to use Agile to drive up transparency and to get the organization predictable, to get it where it can make and meet commitments. And that's often where we're putting in compensating controls, doing the rolling wave, progressive elaboration, kind of backlog management, because we need more look ahead to be able to deal with the dependencies. And then it was, okay, well, once we've done that, then we have agency within the organization. We need to start figuring out how to reduce batch size. And reducing batch size typically came in the form of getting the organization to make smaller bets, right? To put smaller things into the portfolio, right? Things that didn't take 10 years, but maybe took 3 to 6 months, right? That was one way of reducing batch size. And then a lot of the things that we needed to do around some of the DevOps infrastructure, CI/CD deployment infrastructure, getting some of the release management kinds of controls leaned out so that we could start putting things into market faster, and so that we could start getting faster feedback from our clients on it. Because it's one thing to be able to make and meet commitments about a known backlog, but that creates a situation where oftentimes we get really good at building the wrong thing. The only way we get better at building the right thing is to be able to deliver to our customers in smaller batches so that we can get feedback and we can inspect and adapt and adjust as we go. Okay, so we reduce batch size so we can get feedback faster. But when you have a lot of dependencies in the organization, the cost of change is very, very high. So if we learn something new and you have all these dependent teams that are on rails, the ability to pivot is going to be able to be slowed down. So what do we do? Where do we invest dollars to break dependencies within the organization? Excuse me. And then once we have encapsulated organizational units that are relatively dependency free, we can start talking about funding, maybe not just individual Scrum teams, but in our case, expeditions or value streams or something like that. And then the hypothesis is that after we had team-based funding, independent organizational units, then we could say things like, okay, here's a bucket of money, go solve a big problem. Let's inspect and adapt our way and just totally partner with customers, right? So in my head, when we envisioned this original part of the story, what we were trying to do is we were trying to say, like, how do you get the organization from where it is today with all these dependencies and all this misaligned organizational structure and get it to a place where we could literally do like lean startup. And so a lot of times, like I'll call it Basecamp 5, but we'll talk, it's like lean startup mode, right? How do I get a monolithic, tightly coupled organization, have any part of it that can operate as a lean startup? Right. And so what we were trying to do is lay out this series of outcomes over time that would start to peel apart the organization. It's really like legacy refactoring of a mainframe into services. How do we peel apart this monolith so that we can start having these independent teams that operate autonomously? That was what was going on in my head. And a lot of small organizations worked really, really well. Then we started getting the opportunity to do some gigantic organizations. And we started encountering all of those things in the elephant that were easy to ignore when you were working in a smaller organization. So things like compliance and strategy articulation, how product worked and how the funding stuff worked and everything. And it's really been a big internal battle because I don't know that we have the pattern fully sussed out yet. But we got together, actually had a really cool opportunity. I took my executive team out to Snowbird, Utah, and we actually rented the Aspen room where they signed the manifesto. So we got to sit in the room where the manifesto was signed and work on this stuff, right? It was very cool. We got to see the little plaque Alistair Coburn had made, and it's up on the wall. We actually helped them get it up on the wall and things like that. So it was actually pretty cool, especially given that it was the 20th anniversary of the manifesto signing this year. So it was very cool. It's like an interesting way to be part of history. Very honored to be in that room. And so we worked on some of the stuff in that room, which is pretty cool. And what we were talking about was that at some point in time in a lot of these gigantic organizations is that you don't get to bring pieces of the organization all the way through Basecamp 1 to Basecamp 5. It just in practice isn't working that way. In practice is that you get a lot of the organization up into like Basecamp 2, and you create sufficient critical mass within the organization that the things that you were authorizing by exception now become more of the norm. And by the time you get enough of the organization to Basecamp 2, and again, I'm talking thousands of teams, maybe you get 60% of thousands of teams operating at like a Basecamp 2 level, then the pressure to start to change the business ecosystem around you starts to mount, right? It becomes a thing because the operating model of the organization is sufficiently incongruent with how the organization wants to run. It has to be addressed as a first order concern. So we started talking about this idea of summits. And I kind of like the language. We rolled it out in front of a couple of our customers, and it's starting to click to grid is a pretty cool way of telling the story. But I'll apologize if I'm a little short on details, because it's like, for one, we're working it out, but two, I've got like 5 minutes left before you guys want to go to Q&A. So at the point that a sufficient amount of your system is trustworthy, right, and can be delegated into, then we can start to think about changing how we delegate into that system, right? We can change some of how we do product. We can change some of how we do strategy articulation. We can change some of how we do compliance. Again, right, we're playing with this language. The next one we were kind of saying is, okay, in Basecamp 2, we talked about reducing batch size and making smaller bets. So now how do we make better bets? How do we make investment decisions that are more strategically aligned now that we have an organization that we can effectively say, okay, this is what we're trying to do in market. These are the pieces of the organization that need it. Where do we put dollars into the system in small enough batches so that we can start maximizing our economic return in the face of uncertainty and volatility? So the summit 2 is better bets. Wrestled with this too, and there's an interesting thing around being product aligned. One of the things that's really hard is that we know out of the gate that we want a product-driven organization. We know out of the gate that we would like to form teams around products or value streams or what have you. In most mega organizations, that is a very difficult day one activity. Because for one, even if you could identify the value streams, they all intersect and they have dependencies between them, and they use similar capabilities and all kinds of different things. But also the organization doesn't know how to work that way. So a lot of times when we're going through Basecamp 1, Basecamp 2, Basecamp 3, we're actually organizing around business capabilities, because that's something that you can see. So if you think about like the business architecture of the organization, you can see that a lot easier. After you get enough of the organization at critical mass and you run it through Summit 1 and Summit 2, what you're going to realize is that the dependency management gets very exposed, right? So the governance and how coordination costs are happening across the organization becomes very exposed. And you can start to see those costs as first order concerns. And it starts to make a whole lot of sense to take those business capabilities that you've been orchestrating, now that they're independent, or a lot of them are, and we talk about like turning the organization on its side and grouping business capabilities in a way that actually groups them into product organizations. And so you talk about like something like PDO, and PDO lands square in Summit 3 for us, right? And it's interesting because it's like you can't do that PDO until you get enough of the organization operating with agility underneath it, with sufficiently encapsulated organizations to where you can do that like judo move and tip the organization and get it to align differently. But at the point that you do it, right, then the organization is ready for it and can see it. And then the holy grail, right, can change the finance model to start funding products and value streams, right? And then you become outcomes focused after that. So again, we have some work to do to kind of fill in some of the gaps and to tell the story a little bit more tightly. But I think there's like a huge intersection between this story and the elephant story. And so what we're hunting right now is getting, we do this thing called outcomes-based planning, where each expedition to Basecamp has a very set defined outcome. So we're working on our outcomes-based plans for how do you move organizations through summits. But the language is pretty powerful. And so what we're finding is that at the expedition level, we tend to focus on system of delivery, talent, culture, leadership. At the summit level, we tend to focus on more product management, strategy, budgeting, technology, compliance, and controls. And that's the stuff that actually puts fuel on the transformation fire, and it gets the organization out of the way and stops providing resistance to the rest of the organization. So just to kind of drive a couple of these points home, going back to this other diagram, and I apologize for the visual differences, but I literally just decided to interleave like 3 decks this morning while I was getting ready for you guys. I was thinking through the talk. So it's like these 3 inner circles become like the base camp story, and these outer 3 become the summit story. And again, like it's holding together pretty well. And so just to get a little, last but not least, it'll be the last little slide sequence, and then I'll open it up for Q&A. One of the things that's interesting that we're doing is really recognizing that the organization and what we're doing to it are 2 very different things. And so one of the things we talk about a lot is this idea of having a system of transformation that is different than the system of delivery. So regardless of how wide or far you guys are driving Agile, whether you're just doing it at the team level or the enterprise level or the business level, this recognition that you will probably end up with something like an Agile transformation office that manages the change to the system. So I have this idea that like the system of transformation kind of begets the system of delivery. But then there's also this thing, I want to plant a seed in your head that we've been exploring with a lot of our larger clients, this idea of a system of continuous improvement. And the system of continuous improvement, like ultimately over time, it kind of starts acting on the system of delivery. And this was kind of an interesting insight. We were, again, right, we were out Snowbird, we're noodling around all this stuff, and we're talking about this idea of like office of the CIO kinds of things. And what we're starting to see in the industry is that there's a lot of these office of the CIO that does things like change management and business architecture and like all these different things. So what we're starting to see is it's almost like it's like the office of the CIO is this on the business system of continuous improvement stuff on the right, but it has to be set up in such a way that it enables and supports and modifies over time the system of delivery. So it's cool. It's just kind of an interesting story. So basically you guys are getting a lot of like raw thoughts on like how we're starting to think about this. And so I imagine, with the sizes of organizations and the complexity of what you guys are doing, this isn't an answers presentation for you. This is the class of problem and things that you guys need to think about and that you need to have a plan for addressing. Because if you're down at the team level wondering why the transformation isn't moving or why all these things are harder than they need to be, and if that organization would just get out of my way, I'd be able to do this stuff. These are the things that you're up against. It's changing all of these models, but the root of the problem is that we have to get enough of the organization at critical mass before the organization will start to listen to us to change the things that we need changed. Because they're not going to, they'll do it by exception for you at the team level or maybe at the department level, but to get the whole organization operating with agility, it's just a different class of problem. So I think we're at a good place. A few minutes late, apologize. So you guys want to open up for Q&A?
So folks, as has been said in previous sessions, feel free to use the chat feature. You can chat with either me or Stacy privately, and we'll pose the questions if you'd like to remain anonymous, or just shout them out.
Sometimes I found this topic is at such a high level, and I tend to like overwhelm people's prefrontal cortex, and it's kind of like they're like, I don't even know where to drop in and ask a question. No?
That's exactly what I'm going through, Mike.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, so I mean, it's a fascinating thing, right? Because I've been on the practitioner side, right? So the thing I really value about my career is I've been the guy that was project managing teams. And then I was really fortunate that kind of my career path took me through having a really great relationship with my director and my VP. And we ended up with like a playground of about 400 people to try this stuff with. And then went to work for version 1 and got to see like 150 companies in like real life. And then got the opportunity to start this company and to again, right, it's like, you guys know, as a business owner, you got to go out and sell your stuff, right? Or else you don't get clients. And so you're out talking with executives about what their concerns are. And this is just the class of problem, right? And it's interesting, right? Because again, as a consultancy, I mean, obviously it's like, we want to evangelize the story and, obviously we want people to come and hire us to help. But I do think we have an interesting opportunity to educate the market and to start getting more people enlisted to think about these problems and the breadth of what we're trying to do. Because another thing is becoming a CEO of, now granted, I would have never been a CEO if I hadn't started my own company, because I was never corporate CEO material. But one of the things you recognize when you run a business, and we're about 150, 160 people now, we're a fairly decent sized company. And what you realize is that if you don't make money, you don't get to stay in the game, right? If you don't get return on investment for the dollars that you spend, then it's not worth it. And so I remember as a practitioner being on the ground, and it was about building software, and it was about creating great cultures, and it was about doing great work and craftsmanship and all those things. And all that stuff's incredibly important. I'm not minimizing it. But I think as practitioners, we have to recognize that the resistance to change is underneath this umbrella of, this is making me money today. How do I know it's going to make me money tomorrow if I take your word for it? Right. And so the leaders that we're looking for real support, organizational change, ground cover, dollars, all these things, like, we have to get good at connecting the dots for them. I'll spend money on anything in my company if you can tell me and give me reasonable assurance that it's going to make money on the backside. And so that's the job, right? It's like, how do we get all these pieces together? Feel free to stop me if we have any questions. It looks like I've talked enough where we might have a few questions coming up.
Oh, Mike, this is Bill. I was just wondering about
Hi, Bill.
Hey, good to see you.
Yeah, good to see you too, man.
If you looked at what people are doing in outside industry, organizational development stuff, or IC Agile, they have a lot of business agility stuff, or enterprise transformation thinking. I mean, I love your stuff. I think
sure.
You've covered that.
Man, one of the things, and I actually think about this quite a bit, there's a period, in early Leading Agile and before Leading Agile where I read everything and was on top of everything. And I don't do as good a job with that anymore. Because I've just found it's very difficult. Just us as a company, we just made a decision, we're not a safe shop, we're not a less shop, we're not a whatever shop, we're not an IC Agile shop. Because it's like, IC Agile is going to go and do its thing. And and again, I have all the respect for our community, and there are brilliant thinkers, and it's all like a blind man and the elephant problem, right? IC Agile has their take on it. Everybody's got their take. And so, we kind of have our take, but again, all of this stuff has really solid thinking underneath it. I'm actually even seeing more people, like on LinkedIn, because I do pay a bit of attention to LinkedIn, people talking about, like, one of the things, Bill, you've heard me say this for a long time. It's like, we don't believe in like culture first as like a starting place. We talk about how like the organizational structures and then the enabling practices and the way it governs itself and the way it works, it kind of all that stuff drives the culture. And so I'm starting to see a lot more people talk about that. And I think that that's actually really cool, because walking in and telling people you have to have a different mindset, like, that's really tough. If all your incentive plans and your organizational structure and your hierarchy and all these different things is totally trying to drive you to operate one way, and we're like, I need you to have a more open and adaptive mindset. I'm like, well, I get smacked every time that happens. Right? I get, it's great until I don't deliver on time, and then I get punished, or I don't make my bonus, or I don't whatever, right? And so a lot of this stuff is really that we're thinking through is, how do you get all that stuff in alignment so that we can be the kinds of organizations that we actually want to be?
Yeah, well, you're on the right track. It's brilliant stuff. I love your models and systems.
Well, thanks, man.
Thank you.
You still have your yellow hard hat?
Oh, you bet. I got it right up there.
Right. There you go, man. I haven't seen you face to face in a long time, so good job.
Too long. Thanks.
Hey, Mike, Guy has a question about any examples of models for continuous learning.
Any examples for models of continuous learning? I'm not, give me like a little bit more. Like, what are you hunting in that question?
Guy, you out there?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm coming across a lot of these same problems in a transformation we're doing. I wouldn't call it agile transformation, but it always feels that there's this wrapper around everything we end up doing, which is the continuous improvement, continuous learning, whichever one of those terms you want to use. So is there any sort of scaffolding that you put in place? Is it sort of like a PDSA or something like that that you sort of tend to put in place and say, okay, let's see if we can get those feedback loops happening? Or is it something more specific that you found works better? Well,
okay, so I'm gonna see if I can hunt in the space that you're talking about. I don't know that I'm gonna give you a totally straight answer to your question. So when we go and we try to engage, as you might imagine, it's really difficult to walk in as an employee or as a consultant and get people to flip into this way of thinking, right? Really difficult. And so we have this thing. So we've been talking. We're going systems grade. So we talk about system of delivery, system of transformation, system of continuous improvement. We have this thing we talk about internally. We talk about our system of engagement. And so, like, what we try to do is through talks like this, and if somebody called us, then we usually go on the phone. We talk about the principles and all these different things. But then there's like this funneling, this creating shared cognition from like initial workshops through planning the transformation through all these different things. But then you get into this mode where you're going to pilot, right? And then as you pilot these ideas, you start to demonstrate that they work. And then you create like an executive steering committee, you create a transformation leadership team, and they meet on cadences and they review metrics and they do all these different things, right? And so what you have to do around this stuff, and this has just been survival for us, and I'm being super transparent, just survival for us as a consultancy, is engaging the right people. And it all comes down to, for us, is you have to know what you intend to do, how much it's going to cost, what the expected outcome is going to be, and then you have to be able to measure quantitatively that you achieve the outcome. And what we found, and I'll even tell my consultants, because sometimes it's really, really hard to walk in an organization and get tooling set up and to get metrics established and all these things, because a lot of times people don't want to be measured because they've been beaten up by metrics so much, right? So they don't want to. And I'll tell my consultants, if we're not measuring the performance of the transformation, then we're stealing from people, right? Because it's like, if we can't prove it, then it didn't happen. And so part of it is just like building software in a way. It's like you have to deliver on small batches. You have to have acceptance criteria. You have to be able to measure what you've produced against a known backlog. And you have to review it with your product owner periodically. And if for some reason things aren't working, we have to assess why they're not working, what was invalid about our hypothesis, and then adapt what you're doing. We created a little model internally we call Peaster that we do with our clients, where we'll take like an expedition, let's say expedition to base camp 1, it's made up of 12 outcomes. We'll take each of the 12 outcomes and run them through a Kanban board, which basically is planning, socializing, tailoring, implementing, and reinforcing. And so at every step of the way, like, we're constantly running these outcomes through this Kanban, engaging the client, socializing what we intend to do, tailoring it, customizing it for that client, implementing it, and then reinforcing on the backside. So there is a whole lot of stuff in the execution of this that you have to do to engage people and to create safety for them. And again, then measure, because if you create enough safety and you do what you say you're going to do, and you can measurably show that it improved the system, right? Then I think you have a shot, right? It's like you get a chance to play the game. I don't know if that helps or if that was what you're digging at, but that's how I think about it.
Yeah, it does. It sounds like the executive and the visualization of the metrics is the key piece. Thanks.
Yeah, at the end of the day, right, you have to engage people, you have to enter into collaborative relationships, you got to enlist, and then you got to prove it, right? And if you can't prove it and you're just saying, trust me, that's like a really shaky place to be.
All right. Well,
Okay.
Mike, I certainly want to thank you so very much for your presentation. Everyone, thank you so much for your attentiveness and for your great questions. It's been a great session. Stay tuned. Up next, we've got more.
Thank you guys for having me. I really appreciate it. See you in person next year, hopefully.
Absolutely.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bravo.
Yep. Thanks,
Great
guys.
job,
Appreciate it.
folks.